One of the fun things with all of naval history, especially when you're talking about British naval history, is I can link senior officers in a chain of leaders. I can link factions of the Royal Navy going back centuries. And let's just skip forward quite so far. And you can do this disturbingly easily, and you can actually work out their factions. For example, today's discussion is going to be on Admiral George Rodney, the breaking the line pioneer. But if I told you there's a faction of cerebral officers who have a certain approach to how they conduct warfare and how they conduct operations, and they tend to approach to doing lots of different things, going backwards and forwards, and lots of different complexities, to cover for their approach, their attack, so you don't see them coming. You'd probably think, if I was talking about World War II, you'd think that's going to be Cunningham. Well, Cunningham, Andrew Cunningham, was trained by Roger Keyes in World War One era. Roger Keyes, was of course trained by Edward Seymour, who had been trained by his father, his father's brother, Michael Seymour, who had been trained by a guy called Charles Napier, who was trained by a guy called Edward Pellew. And if you go through that list and look at their operations, you find there's a common theme going on. These are all admirals who tend to approach things from highly analytical, highly choreographed methodologies. And there is a series of officers who follow down this line. This is the patronage system at work. This is not officers necessarily promoting officers from the same background, and that's one of the things you work out very quickly. For a faction to die in the Royal Navy within a generation or two, you have a faction which is picking for background rather than mental focus, rather than their psychological profile, rather than their methodology. And so you have that as a faction. And today's discussion, I'm going to ask you basically is, without looking it up, I'm going to talk about Rodney. Like Pellew's faction, still exists this day, and I could go back further than Pellew, and I can link it up to all the way up to Anson, and I can even go a bit back further if I want to. It'd be really quite fun. And show that faction's route. I could do the similar thing with Rodney. I can go and show the faction he comes from backwards, and I can show it forwards. But I want you to listen to me talk about Rodney, and I want you to think about what faction he is on, and where those officers come from, and who's been promoting this style officer for that time. And that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to belong to the same family. Sometimes officers with the same family same name, they might even be father, son, they might be uncle, nephew, etc. They don't necessarily belong to the same factions. Doesn't necessarily matter. The factions are looking for what style of naval officer you are. Those are going to be the successful factions, and how they promote and how the patronage system works. You're looking for an officer with a certain style approach. And by the way, at certain points in history, the Royal Navy literally goes hunting for, we have the X situation, we need an officer therefore from Y faction, because they're usually the ones who handle X situation. And it's literally like that. It's almost like the Royal Navy is relying on certain tools to be self-perpetuating. If you consider your personnel to be tools and their aptitudes and capabilities to be a tool set, to be something you can use, you are saying, right, these factions are going to promote officers like themselves. That's going to be, as long as they are doing that, they're promoting people of like mind rather than something else. that's a useful thing to have, and we're going to continue to support it. The moment they start trying to promote for a reason other than they think the same, that's when those factions break apart. Because it's far easier to hold a faction of together who have similar methodologies and approach. It's far easier for a faction to agree and support each other than it is for a faction held together by something else less tangible. I.e., you've gone, well, I like naval officers who have beards, so I'm going to select officers who have a good beard. Well, speaking as someone who I think has quite a decent beard going on, it's trimmed, but it's decent beard. That doesn't mean I necessarily agree with other bearded people. Some of the best conversations in my life have been absolute constant debates with my colleague Drakenfell, who also has a very fine beard, sitting on top of a wooden shed we were repairing the roof of, which is my old office, and having a debate. Those were wonderful times. Those were wonderful discussions. We agree on some things, we disagree on others. It wouldn't make for a good faction just if the only thing that combined us was the fact we had decent beards. That wouldn't work. Thinking similarly, in terms of methodology of how you analyze and deal with problems, that matters far more. That is far more essential. As said, I've given you one faction. I've shown you the link. Prelude to Cunningham. And I can go further than that, and I can come more recent than that, from that same faction. And, by the way, it gets really fun because you can point in, and I can include people like Michael Clarke in the Falklands War, and Sandy Woodward, and I can point to where those factions have gone, what sections of the Navy they're now in, whether their faction has gravitated towards one section of the Navy or the other. You know, these things can all be pointed to. It's interesting. But as said, this is not the faction of Rodney I've been talking about so far. And I don't want you getting the impression that Rodney's faction is not necessarily cerebral. A faction which includes Rodney, Hood, and Horatio Nelson. All three of those officers in quick succession is not a bad faction to be part of. Doesn't include Collingwood, though. He's in another faction entirely. Another patronage line. It's all fun when you start to realise it. And by the way, most modern navies, whilst we might claim the patronage system has disappeared, it hasn't. It doesn't. It still perpetuates. It still carries on. It's who do admirals choose to their flag officers? How do they select them? Who do captains choose to mentor most in terms of their lieutenants? In terms of their officers aboard their ships, they might decide someone fits them better to mentor. Who do they suggest? What avenues of path do they suggest for those officers they have under their care to approach their career? All these things can have an effect. So, Rodney is a complicated soul. He is a product of his time. He is motivated by the issues of his time. He is a man of his time. Please don't judge him as anything else. Please don't judge him as anything other than being of his time. That is how you should always judge people in history. You cannot hold everyone at a time to the standards we set ourselves today, to the ethics and morals we necessarily hold ourselves today. We cannot. Our understanding is different than their understanding of what those ethics and morals will be. And it's one of the worst charges I often see in history is people going, this person was Hippocratic, this person was unethical, immoral. And there are some who certainly were. But that only works if you're judging them by the morals of their time, rather than the morals of today. The classic example I sometimes give when I'm talking about it is, you have to remember the British and the French empires and the other empires in their period thought they were they were okay. They thought they were ethically fine. Mostly. The scenario which is always weird is when you bring up the Belgian Empire, which was the empire which they all disliked and all felt was giving empires a bad name. And if we consider by our standards, quite rightly, we would not judge the British Empire or the French Empire to necessarily be good things, to be a moral thing, because of how they were ran and what they ran. They might have been a feature of their period, but they wouldn't be what we do today. But that's always the point I go is, they thought they were doing the right thing at that time. But they all agreed Belgium was doing the wrong thing. Or rather, the King of Belgium was. You must remember the Belgian government didn't even want to take ownership of their own empire. They just said it was the King's area. Eventually, they took it off the King because it was giving Belgium a bad name. That's how badly run the Belgian Congo was. So that's what you always have to think about it, is you have to go, well, the trouble is, in their heads, they think they're the good guys. So you can't treat them as if they're necessarily the bad people. You can't put it on and go, they are thinking in a bad way, because they're not. To them, it's morally fine what they're doing. It's morally just for him to go and wreck an island and take it over and loot everything in sight, because that's the rules of war at the time. That's fine. It's not what we do today. Well, it's not what we'd hope we do today if we following the Geneva Convention and various other things we've got to try and civilize war, but it's what they did at the time. So you have to judge him by the standards of the time. And the thing is, even he is not always happy with all his actions when he's looking back on them. He makes decisions in temper. He makes decisions based on calculations. Sometimes those calculations don't bear fruit. And that's the other important thing. For some reason, and I associate this to myself with the comic book era of the post-Second World War age, especially the early comic books, and their effect on cultural memory and institutional memory. We suddenly started believing that our heroes had to be above reproach. And first of all, we thought they must be above reproach and ignored everything that was around them, which made them actually human and therefore worthy of being called a hero, to make them this perfect thing. And then, slowly over time, we realized they weren't perfect, and suddenly they're not worthy of being heroes. Well, maybe call me a bit old-fashioned and a bit weird, but I like the people who keep trying as my heroes, the ones who don't give up, the ones who, for all their bad points, try to still accomplish something great, something amazing, something of service. That's my hero. That's who I look up to. Because humans are more of a sum of their good points and bad points. They are more than the sum of those components of their personality. Rodney certainly is. Rodney is probably one of our more complicated heroes. And it's rather worthy, I think, that his name is associated with such a powerful and influential battleship of the interwar period in World War II. Although, knowing Rodney, he would have complained about the speed. Honestly, if someone had told Rodney that they were choosing more armor and just slightly bigger guns over a faster ship which was almost as solidly built and would have had that much greater speed, he would probably have started whacking people over the heads. Because the one thing for Rodney is when he is on operations, when he is doing movement, etc., he is typified by a tremendous strategic speed. He is very good at getting the best out of his ships and stealing huge distances from his opponents in terms of strategic movement of this fleet. From place to place, from point to point. And that is something that passes into the Royal Navy over its generations, over its history. That is something which Hood will go on to do, which Nelson will go on to do, which, honestly, his faction will be associated with for a long time. The ability to steal a strategic march over their opponents by rapidly arriving in locations before they expect to be there. They're an interesting group. So let's start off with the people who trained him. Now, Vice Admiral Matthews is someone who really has to be up there. Vice Admiral Thomas Matthews. He is another one of those great strategic movement people. Captain Henry Medley is an early tutor, an early influence. And the Duke of Chandos, well, the Duke is an important friend at court who helps him grow, who helps him develop his capabilities and see his service. They really are the makers of his early career, the patrons, the mentors, those who help him grow up to become the officer he's going to become. You know, he starts off with Henry Medley, who that's when he first goes to sea. Yes, he'd served on the Sunderland beforehand, but he really hadn't had much good experience on the Sunderland. It's when he gets to Dreadnought and he serves on 1734 to 1737 under Henry Medley that he really starts to become a naval officer and starts to excel as being a naval officer. And it's from there he manages to get the patronage of the Duke of Chandos, thanks to the intercessions of Medley. And thanks to Chandos, he's introduced to Sir Thomas Matthews, who basically goes, I quite like you. You're going to come serve on my flagship. Thomas Matthews was the Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Station. You have him as your mentor. That's going to help you with your promotion. That's going to help you get up the ranks. It really is. And unsurprisingly, thanks to that, he does pretty well at that point. He gets command quite early on and managed to achieve the rank of post captain very early on in his career. Very early on, because he joins the Navy, he goes to sea in 1732. Well, a little over 10 years later, he's a post captain. 10 years service, he's a post captain. 3 of those years were with Medley. Another 3 were with Matthews, pretty much. So 6 out of 10 years. And by the way, he also in that time spent 18 months in Lisbon, having a lovely time with lovely ladies, from all the sounds of things. That's pretty much another thing you associate with Rodney. He is a serialist. He is a serialist. And he gets command. He gets command early on. In fact, his first command is the Plymouth. A 60-gun 4th rate. And by the way, these are going to turn out to be ships which he's going to have a lot of affection for. He's going to spend a lot of time with 4th rates. He's never really given a frigate. He has some experience with smaller ships, but it's 60 guns vessels, 60 gun 4th rates. Remember, 64 would make them a 3rd rate. 60 guns makes them a 4th rate. It's the joy of history at this point. They are a 4th rate. Not a 3rd rate, a 4th rate. Just slightly smaller. And the point is, though, They're good ships. They're useful ships. They have 2 gun decks. They have firepower. They have maneuver. And it's while he's on one of these 4 freights, these lovely little 4 freights he's on, that he will meet Samuel Hood. And also take his younger brother, James Rodney, under his wing. He enjoys having these ships under his command, and he uses them well. He uses them so well that he's often involved in quite a few battles. You know, while from Plymouth, he goes to the Ludlow Castle. Ludlow Castle is where he gets Samuel Hood and James Rodney, and then he gets the 60-gun Eagle, another 4 freight. And it's on this vessel, again with Rodney, again with James Rodney, his younger brother, and Samuel Hood with him, because he's training them up. He gets to take part in the Battle of Cape Finisterre under Admiral Hawke. And this is important because Matthews and Hawke had an interesting relationship. Now, Matthews had been leading his faction. They both shared a bit of a history in terms of who'd trained them and who'd sponsored their promotions. But the thing is, with Matthews, after the whole dispute with Admiral Lestock and Battle of Toulon affair, had of course been forced out of the Navy. And who's taken over leading that faction? Well, it's good old Hawke. And Hawke doesn't mind being in charge of the faction, but now he's reforming that faction, those like-minded officers, and one of the ones he's getting in under his connections on his command is a good old gentleman called Rodney. And Rodney's going to be very useful for him at the Battle of Cape Finisterre, because he's some of his key ships at a line. And by the way, the Battle of Cape Finisterre is rather a fun thing when you start looking through the names, because you have John Moore in charge of Devonshire, Thomas Coates, Thomas Fox, Charles Saunders, Henry Harrison, Charles Watson, Thomas Hannaway, Arthur Scott, Robert Harland, Philip Samaras, John Bentley, and George Rodney. Now, of course, Samaras, if you think you've heard that name before, well, his nephew, James Samaras, who's, of course, famously has a dispute with Nelson after the Battle of Naval, because he doesn't agree with doubling up the fleet because he's worried about the ships firing upon each other, but other than that has previously been quite a good friend of Nelson's, is one of the people who will eventually be sponsored, in effect, by Rodney. They're from the same faction. And this is the point. Hawke pulls his fleet together, but largely he managed to secure quite a large number of officers from a similar faction to him. And there's a reason he wants them. There's a reason he needs them at this point. Now, you should realize that at this period that a 60-gun ship in the period we're talking about, 1745, etc., whilst we would possibly still call it lower end of the capital ships, and 4 for 8 is normal, there are quite a lot of them running around which are 60, 64, 66 guns. They are quite the common thing. In 1745, the third-rate 74 horde has not started to take over the world. Yet. And they still hadn't managed to achieve that in 1747. It was a few years away that they would do it. But the Second Battle of Cape Finisterre, HMS Eagle is positioned exactly where Hawke needs it to be. Hawke is at the Hawke has a whole load, if you look down them, John Bentley in Defiance, George Rodney in Eagle, and Phil Samaras in Nottingham in front of them, Philip Durrell and Charles Stevens in Gloucester and Portland behind Rodney. He's put some very aggressive officers at the back of his line. Probably because after seeing what's happened to Bing, after seeing what's happened at Toulon and all these other things, he wants to be sure the back of his line gets into the fight. And he doesn't have a scenario where he theoretically has a 14 ships a line to 8 ships a line advantage, especially when the French are protecting 250 merchant vessels, an Indiaman and a frigate as well with their force. Theoretically he has an advantage, but he only has an advantage if his ships fight. He only has the advantage if his ships fight. If the ships at the back of the line, if the ships at the back of the formation don't engage, he doesn't have an advantage. And so, with these officers in that position, he's sure they're going to go offensive. He's sure they're going to be aggressive. And, by the way, in this battle, it's kind of interesting because, well, the British managed to get some ships onto the far side of the French line, which means they get to double them. They're doubling up the rear of the French line. And that meant the British ships, despite having theoretically less firepower than their French counterparts, because their French counterparts were mostly 74-gun vessels. They've got 80 guns, some 74s, and some 64s, but, you know, they're mostly fairly heavily armed vessels. They are beginning their 74 horde. At this point, the British, having it captured and had a good look at us at night 74. But, you know, afterwards, they're doing this, they're doing these operations, they're managing to double up, and that makes the French go from having an advantage to having a disadvantage because they're being engaged from both sides. And that's a bad position for a ship to be in. Because do you have enough crew to fire the broadsides on both sides and service the broadsides on both sides? And remember, they're being engaged from one side. They're being engaged. The British ships are only engaging one side of theirs. So they're only having to keep half their guns manned. So if they get wounded, etc., it's far easier for them to fill holes than the French ship in the middle, which is having to arm and fire and crew all their guns. The Battle of Cape Finisterre is an interesting one because they do achieve a level of control over the channel afterwards. It's a very important battle, therefore, for British national security. It's also, honestly, one of the battles even of Hawke, which is more forgotten. He does other cooler battles. This is a straightforward... Well, you could argue it's a little bit of a mugging, because it is, whilst they are smaller, there are 14 ships of the line in Hawke's force, and they capture 6 French ships of the line out of 8. They capture 7 merchant ships, and 4,000, roughly, French sailors captured. It's a battle and a half for 47. And after this, well, thanks to the lessons of Matthews especially, but also of Hawke and others, and Medley, to be honest, Rodney knows that in peacetime the best thing he can do is get a governor's post. And the governor of Newfoundland comes with being also a commodore. And you get a large ship to command, so you get to draw captain's pay, commodore's pay for being the flag officer on the station, and governor's pay. And if you come from a poor background, this is a dream. This is an absolute dream in terms of being self-financing. And as you can imagine, such opportunities the Royal Navy doesn't waste on officers they don't care about. Yes, there's patronage. That's a factor. But as I've always pointed out, patronage is a two-way street. The idea that patronage, you just sponsor someone just because they are a relative or just because, they're a friend. No. That's often how the introductions are made. And that might get them in the door as a midshipman. That might be enough to get them in the door as a midshipman. But you don't patronize someone who is not going to give you anything in return. Who's not going to return you with laurels. Who's not going to reward you by making you look good. You don't. It's not worth it for you from the perspective of being the commanding officer or being a senior officer. Again, one of the things about factions, and I know this is a theme I've been talking through this video, and I'm going to keep talking through this video, is they have to keep selecting for people who are going to bring out the quality of their faction, the quality of their perspective, the quality of their methodology. They can't just pick people, and this is when they run into trouble, and that's when you do get factions which end. There are factions which have ended in the Royal Navy. There are factions which have disappeared. And lines of patronage which have run out. And usually they run out because people have selected someone to patronize because of who they are, not what they're capable of, not what they think. That has always been the dark road to go down. It's a really weird scenario to talk about because in some ways it is completely antithetical to the modern world. The idea of you using your connections to get ahead, of people using their connections to help people they like get ahead. But at the same point, it actually isn't. Because it's also kind of how we don't like to talk about it, but the modern world still does work. In that, if you've got people who are good quality in your team as a leader, you're going to want to promote them. You're going to want to help them rise. Because that's also going to make you look good. And if they do well on other assignments, that makes you look good. If they end up running another department and they do it really well, who was the person who found them? Who was the person who promoted them? Oh! So they're very good at nurturing talent. Okay. Who else are they promoting? Which is good for other people you're supporting and promoting. But also, they're good at nurturing talent at that level. Perhaps they'll be good at nurturing talent at the higher level. There are two principles of promotion I often ascribe to in any organization when I'm looking at it. There's the Peter principle, which is the concept that people are promoted to their level of stupidity, to the point at which the issues with them are no longer affecting frontline operations. It's amazing when you look at organizations, sometimes you detect people, they're literally being promoted as far as you can get them away from actual contact. And that's usually when you cannot find a reason to fire them because they don't technically do a bad job. They just don't do it in a good way. And you just go, right then, where can we find a position to put them? The other one, and this is usually in better run organizations, where they're looking for leaders who are good teachers, who are good promoters. And that is also something about the factions in Navy, because the factions would help officers get command. They would help officers reach senior positions. They would help officers justify their positions at senior levels and being given fleets to command. If you are a good commander, if you have formed a good squadron, if you have run a good ship. And running a good ship depends on having good officers. Running a good squadron depends on having good officers. Running a good fleet depends on having good officers. You cannot do those things without people who are good in those positions below you. You cannot trust an idiot with a warship, especially not in the age of sail. You have to have someone you can trust who's going to do a good job in it. And that's the interesting thing about factions. Sometimes people in the factions do not like each other personally. They have no time for each other personally. But they get along professionally. They get along professionally. And that is a key difference. That is a level of maturity that we all hope to aspire to. Don't you know, we can work with people who we might not like on a personal level, but who we respect on a professional level, and so we will work with them. That takes a level of leadership and a level of skill. Rodney was a good example of this. Rodney was a very good example of this. But he was also a very good example because he gets picked up by people like John Russell, like the 4th Duke of Bedford, like John Montague, the 4th Earl of Sandwich, because he is good at it. He is good at training up officers beneath him. He is good at working out who's going to be a good subordinate. And not in a subordinate as in they're going to do exactly what I tell them whenever I tell them without questioning. That, again, doesn't help. Because, believe it or not, a captain can only be on one ship at a time, so can an admiral. You can't afford to have unthinking, unquestioning dullards who will just do only what you say when you say it in command of a ship. Which is also the problem. Because the moment you have people who can think for themselves, they can reason for themselves and come up with a different idea than you can. And you still have to persuade them that they are going to follow your idea. And whilst, in theory, people go, well, you're an admiral, you've given an order, they'll follow it. As many admirals in the Age of Sail will tell you, and even modern admirals will tell you, a ship's captain, they can execute your orders in two ways. One, with full celerity, and as you necessarily wish them, as specifically you inscribed. Or they can exercise it with thought. And they can exercise it with thought in a way which still looks like it's following your orders, but isn't quite. I.e., their ship, I know we're supposed to be sailing in line to break the French formation, but, we just lost the wind. Yeah, we just lost the wind. Sorry, weren't able to support you. Sorry, weren't able to do that maneuver. World War II, there are instances I've covered where destroyer captains had radios which just went wrong. It's terrible. The radio just went wrong. And even full-on battleship captains would... Oh, sorry? What was I supposed to be doing? Aircraft carriers, which didn't drop out of line when they were supposed to, and were still engaging when you came across enemy cruisers. We can go through the list in World War II. Lots of captains who didn't do exactly what they were instructed to, because they were exercising their own judgment. We can go to the Falklands War, and I can give you examples. Because you want a captain to exercise their judgment. And that's another thing the faction has to do when they're looking for officers. As I said, they're looking for people who think alike, as in, they think along a similar line of reasoning. But the important point is they have to think. There is no point having an unthinking officer. Now, despite having the lofty title of governor, basically what his main job to do was to go out with the fishing fleet from Newfoundland, and be in charge of making sure that's okay and make sure the settlements are okay and then bring it back. He oversees 3 of these trips. But while he's doing that, he starts to come into contact with, as mentioned, the Duke of Bedford and Lord Sandwich. He starts to become in contact with them politically. He stands to be elected in 1750 at Launceston. He fails to get elected. He stands for Saltash, and one of the Admiralty seats. And by the way, an Admiralty-controlled seat basically means the voters in that particular area are overwhelmingly connected to the Admiralty. They might be employees of the board directly. They might be naval officers. They might be other things connected with the Admiralty, but basically when we talk about an Admiralty-controlled seat, it means there's a seat where such a preponderance of the voters owe their living to the Admiralty, that if the Admiralty goes, this is our person, they vote for them. And what you have to remember is the Admiralty is usually fairly clever. They don't just get MPs for one side. They make sure some Admiralty MPs are elected for both sides of both the government and the opposition. Now, They're always very careful about how many, and it always looks so amazingly subtle, but it's actually, once you start looking at the overall pattern, you start working through it, you realise, oh, yeah, they're making sure the naval officers, not just through factions in terms of their leadership, but balance in terms of their factions of politics, and they're making sure there are some in both camps in those slots. They want connections, because who might, you never know, there might be an upset. Government might end up not being the party you think it's going to be. And if you put all your eggs in one party basket, you no longer have the traction with the government and the government, do you? You're all in opposition. That's terrible. Yeah, the Royal Navy has moved on to an extent. They're trying to get the politics out of the command structure, but they're still still keeping themselves in politics. It's one of those things. Anyway, he gets Saltash. He's elected there in 1751, when he's on a round trip to Newfoundland. He's elected. He then sails home from Newfoundland via Spain and Portugal with some merchant escorts. But he's doing his job. He is technically ill for about 10 months in this period, and technically is unemployed, but let's be honest, he has prize money, and he's developing his estate at Old Alresford in Hampshire, which he'd brought with prize money. So there is part of me which does think ill might be so much as cover for, I don't want to go away to sea for the next 10 months whilst I, how do I put this politely, do some home improvements. And speaking as someone who I know keeps bringing this up, has recently moved house and has been dealing with this property and getting it all sorted out. Taking 10 months to sort out a property you've bought the size of the estate at Old Alresford, that's fricking efficient. All praise to the man. You know, claiming he was ill for 10 months to do it, the guy deserves a medal for completing that. This house is a lot smaller than Old Alresford, and yeah, I don't think I'll get this finished in 10 months. In 1753, he gets his first wife. He marries a lady called Jane Compton, who is sister of Charles Compton, who is the 7th Earl of Northampton. Now, I won't get into the whole debate he had as to whether he was going to marry Jane or her younger sister Kitty, and the fact he met them mostly in Lisbon during his visits to that city rather than the UK. But that's because their father was consul at that time. The previous Earl of Northampton was consul there. They had a good marriage. They had 3 children together. But they got married in 1753. They had 3 children together, and she died in 1757. Now, by all accounts, they have a good marriage, and he does manage to spend quite a couple of years of peace in terms of on a guard ship, in charge of a guard ship, which I've done a video about in Portsmouth, which, as I mentioned in that video, if you're the captain of a guard ship and you've got a good first lieutenant and you've got a wife nearby in an estate or place you're in, a good relationship with the Admiral, you can probably semi-work from home and be aboard ship 1 to 2 days a week, just keeping track of everything. But the 7 Years' War did break out. It's always helpful when that happens. In 1754. And there are various issues which happen in this period. There are various issues which happen with the 7 Years' War, including Admiral John Byng. But the first thing that happens from Rodney's perspective is the raid of Rochefort. And he takes part in the cruises on the Hawke and Boscawen in 1755 and 56. So it's only 57. And he's always been very good at getting home to his wife to try and take care of her and try and get her up. She dies, as I said, in January 1757. It's around this time he also gets command of HMS Dublin, a 74-gun, third-rate ship of the line. Not the same one which will be razzed and take part in the Paulette affair, which I've also covered on this channel, the British occupation of Hawaii, the previous HMS Dublin. And Yeah, he takes part in the Rochefort raid under Hawke, and he learns firsthand what it means to have a lackadaisical general for amphibious warfare, and how problematic it is. And it's kind of interesting because the raid on Rochefort involves Wolfe and Mordaunt on the army side, and Hawke, Rodney on the naval side, and they are all learning and going on for things later on. And from Hawke, Rodney is learning that, frankly, at a certain point, just kick the army ashore. Because he's refusing to attempt a landing. Wolfe is learning from Mordaunt that, oh my lord, can you come up with any more excuses? You're starting to sound like a Formula 1 racing driver. Seriously, the man was efficient at sounding like one. They'd gone for Rochefort. Their plan had been a very quick strike, a bold stroke, as Pitt would write, that would force the French to postpone their invasion of Germany. Basically, the idea was, we do a raid in enough force on the French coast, you're going to need to protect the coast, that's going to deny you being ability to use those forces elsewhere. It's how naval powers often weaken land powers. They tie down the forces. The trick is to tie them down with a battle fleet, which stops them being able to interfere with your forces, which allows you to command at sea, which means you can tie down their land forces with amphibious forces. You have the two things. The battle fleet, whatever form it is. It might be a line of battleships, it might be a line of ships on line, it might be a carrier battle group. And then you have the amphibious task group. And the two together will allow you to tie down a land force, because with the carrier battle group operating in that area, if we use the modern scenario, but ships line, a large battle fleet in this period, in order to get to the amphibious task group, you have to send out your own fleet to engage and drive them off. If you can't do that, that fleet, whether it's ships line, carrier battle group, whatever it is, has secured what we call control the sea. It might not be complete command of the sea, it might not be complete, but it's area control. They control enough area that the amphibious task group can operate whatever it is, landing force, whatever it can operate wherever it needs to be, and can land troops where it wants to. And to defend a coastline requires a lot more troops than to attack it. It really does. It really requires a lot more troops to defend the coastline than to attack it. Because also there's the strategic mobility of the ships. It's often quicker to move that force on the ships, because they'll be moving for 24 hours a day. The ships will keep moving, and it doesn't affect the troops, doesn't tire them out, doesn't wear out their equipment, because they're aboard the ships. They'll keep moving. Whereas personnel ashore, you need to give them areas, you need to support them, all these things. Yeah. That's how naval forces work, and how you can use naval forces to tie down land power. But it only works if they actually get off those ships and actually carry out a frigating raid. Only works. And the trouble is, they don't. They don't. The Navy does. The Navy does. Colonel James Wolfe does some interesting things, but the vast majority of the force under General Mordaunt does nout. Does absolutely nout. Lots of naval officers come out with credit, but unfortunately there's another disaster which really sort of overplays. And there is an interesting thing, because at the same time as this is all going on, and I'm going to put the Siege of Louisburg up behind it because it's more fun to have that than showing his book plug, there's also the trial of Byng, Admiral Byng, who's famously shot in his quarterdeck for failure to relieve Minorca. And Rodney dodges being on that trial. Rodney tries to use his contacts, everything he can, to try and soften the blow. He isn't able to, because he doesn't think Byng deserves to be shot for it. But the thing is, they're looking at trying the Admiral for this. There are discussions of whether the generals at Rochefort should be tried for this, for cowardice. The army manages to avoid that. The army says they would describe it, some officers describe it, they avoided the humiliation of that, the stain of that. But it suddenly meant for the Navy and for the Admirals, they suddenly felt they were being held to a higher standard. And this has two impacts. One, it allows naval officers to go as long as, our only safety is if we're attacking the enemy. And secondly, it means that when you're a senior officer involved, kind of like what happens at Copenhagen with Nelson, if you're a senior admiral in charge, you have to think about how your junior's going to be treated if they're forced to withdraw. If you think it might be an option, it might be necessary for them to withdraw, sending an order for them to withdraw that they can choose to ignore or not, that helps. Because if they do decide to withdraw, you, who are standing outside the situation, can give a clear argument of I didn't see the point in losing ships, and I had follow-on plans, so it was just round one. It really didn't matter. But if they don't withdraw, well, they ignored your order, and they must have known because they were at the spot, so they could see things which I couldn't from my position. So it's fine either way, but it means no one can execute them for cowardice. No one can try and trump up charges. At this point, Rodney starts to get more experiences. He's on the list. He's going to be promoted to Rear Admiral quite soon. Now, he is serving on the taking of Louisburg, the siege of Louisburg, which is, how do I put this politely? It's an operation, again, he's watching. This time, the Army and Navy definitely do cooperate, and the firepower is decisive. The Navy stopped initial reinforcements coming from Mediterranean, so initially they're facing a lot weaker forces, so they do cutting out operations and various things to support the amphibious assault. But you also have to remember, amphibious operations like this are always running against the clock, because the enemy might try and reinforce. The enemy might try and take advantage of any time. So yeah, Wolfe also shows up quite well and hits his brigade, which gets ashore first. It's a very different operation to Rochefort. Very different operation to Rochefort, and far more successful. With that being said, though, shameless book plug. So, shameless book plug. Well, this week's turning into a bit of an Age of Sail period, isn't it? It really is turning into a bit of an Age of Sail stuff. Because we have this today, coming out probably on the Tuesday at the end, because I think it's probably going to... We have Earl St. Vincent on Wednesday, and on Thursday we have Mary Rose to HMS Victory, the changing and the construction. So yeah, it's an Age of Sail. It's very much an Age of Sail week. Hope you enjoy it. Thank you to everyone else over for supporting the channel. Thank you for helping making this possible, enabling me to spend roughly 2 to 3 days a week working on this stuff. And being able to do these videos in this channel, because without it, without your support, it wouldn't be possible. Most weeks I spend about 3 days on channel stuff, and a couple of days now on other research stuff for books and things. So thank you for that. You're what makes it possible. And these books and the other books which are coming, I have a feeling this month's book, the book I was hoping to come out this month, is going to be delayed. But that's mainly because instead of making sure I'm perfectly happy with it and doing all the final preps I need to, I have been rebuilding internet and all sorts of things for the house. I might, by the end of the month, I have said it will be a late birthday present to myself, and it will be the end of the month. So I may have caught up. I'm aiming to try and catch up, but I'm also not going to make promises I can't deliver on, and also not going to... I prefer to under-promise, over-deliver as a rule, than over-promise, under-deliver. Over-promise and then under-deliver. So I prefer to under-promise and over-deliver. That's my policy. So if I Promise, I'm going to do my best to get it out, but I think it's going to be delayed, and then I get it out on time. Great. If I say, honestly, I'm not sure, and I don't, then I've been honest, and I haven't let anyone down. Hopefully. So yeah, that's the fun things. But thank you. You're what makes all the support. Your support through liking this channel, through watching the videos with the adverts, through being a Prime member and watching the things, to being an actual member of the channel and watching it, to being a patron, to super chats, super thanks. All those things add up. They really do, and they really do help the channel grow. I cannot overemphasize, and this is one of the things I've learned now going through the algorithm and going through to some of the lessons. I've been doing YouTube, and I do try and turn up and watch as many of their advice videos as they have for how to grow a channel, because, well, I'd like to reach 20,000 subscribers by Christmas this year, so that the bet is finally over between my mother and my aunt. Don't get me started. It's moved to 20,000 now. So I go watch all those, and I cannot tell you how much those interactions are valued by the algorithm. The more you like a channel, the more you comment, all the financial stuff, of course, but that's fairly obvious with YouTube because they're a company. But all the interactions really do help. Really do help promote a channel, so thank you. One of the interesting things I was having a discussion with someone saying, I like some of your videos, but I don't like all of them. And my thought was, that's a good thing. Because I'm trying to get as many people as I can interested in naval history. And everyone's an individual with their own interests and what's going to attract them. So some videos are going to attract you into naval history and some videos aren't. And whilst I'd love to make all videos universally attractive to everyone, I can't do that. No one can do that. But hopefully I can make them all interesting. They might not be attractive, but they're all interesting. And that's what I strive for. Anyway. That being said, let's go on with the 7 Years' War and when he becomes a Rear Admiral in 1759. I've already covered John Byng. Now, being made a Rear Admiral, that's a high point. That means you're now on the path to riches. Well, not necessarily. For a man who's come from the background he has, this is a high point. This is status, this is glory, this is honour. But there's also a reality check here. Admirals can earn a lot of money, but it's going to depend on which stations they're in charge of. It's also going to cost them a lot of money because they have to entertain a lot more officers. They have to entertain a lot more often for diplomatic means. They have to be far more politically and strategically aware. They have to maintain a larger staff, whether that's formal or informal, as I've talked about in other videos on structure at this period. There is a formal staff and there is an informal staff. The idea that the officers managed to send out all the letters they did in the times they did with just a single writer and, their flag lieutenant is interesting to say the least. There are many other informal personnel which make up their staff structures. And they have to manage those staff structures, those informal structures and formal structures. And the thing is, a captain can sail independently. A captain could get command of a good frigate, go sailing and capture lots of prizes. But Rodney's never really been one of those captains. Yes, he's made prize money. Yes, he has. He's made good prize money. But he's always been far more interested in being big ships. Now, there is a reason for that. Because if you're going to do a massive gamble for glory and riches, the big battles are where it's at. You can accrue a lot as a frigate captain. You can really accrue a lot. But it's mostly going to be a lot of small fry. An admiral in charge of a raid on a harbour or attacking a fleet, fighting a battle. Oh, you can set up your family for generations if you play your cards right. And that's what Rodney's about. Rodney, ultimately, he is a very good naval officer, please don't get me wrong, but he is motivated most massively by his desire to make sure his family is set for its future. He came from a poor background. He came from a hard-working background, but he came from a background which knew its limitations. He wants his children, his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren to not understand the concept of limitations if he can avoid it. He wants them to have the security, the certainty, and therefore the prosperity that underpins that. And that's fine. In this period, that's perfectly normal. And that's not a bad motivator. And his first command is the raid on Le Havre. Now, this was another of those operations which is designed to distract the French, distract the enemy. And realistically, whilst he would spend quite a lot of time and go back and actually attempt to do it a second time, the first bombard was the most successful. That's when he uses his ships to get in close. He managed to get bomb ships, which are usually coal ships, which have been turned into mortar vessels, mounting mortars, in nice and close and bombarded the town to start fires and basically cause trouble and look like you're carrying out an amphibious operation, look like you're going to do more. They're about distracting land forces. It's Quiberon Bay, it's the Battle of Lagos, those that defeat the French fleets and ultimately lead to, well, I wouldn't say exactly peace, but they do lead to a scenario where he's able to be elected for Penryn in 1761, another safe seat, safe Admiralty seat. Penryn, all these lovely places that, you know, if you look at them, you'll soon notice how close they are to various naval establishments, and it works. That's how the Admiralty spreads its influence. After he'd been elected as MP, Anson selects him to command the amphibious force for the attack on Martinique. And let's be honest, he studied a lot of amphibious warfare. He's now carried out some raids for it. Now it's probably about time he'd be used to actually carry out an actual amphibious operation. And Martinique it's going to be. Now he had advantages. He had General Monckton in charge, who had a combined force of colonial troops, some from America, and British troops. A very, very mixed force, but a very energetic force. And Rodney was Rodney. Rodney basically managed to get there and goes, right then, so you want to land your troops? We've got roughly an enemy force of 1,200 regulars, 7,000 militia, 4,000-ish privateers. And you've got roughly 8,000 troops to land to fight them, but you've also got the fleet. And you're going to keep using the fleet. And they use it. They manage to land both far enough away they can get the troops ashore. In a typical British amphibious operation, the British seem to historically dislike the idea of a coup de main. They dislike the idea of landing straight into an enemy force and then attacking. They usually prefer to go for what at the time was sometimes called a coup de grande, a phrase which has dropped out of use. Very much dropped down. But basically, the coup de grande was when you would land within the grander area, is how it's been explained in a couple of books I've read where they've actually discussed it. And those were very old books. I haven't seen a book which has been published since 1925 refer to this. So if you've never heard of this point before, don't worry. Up until about 15 years ago, I hadn't either. And I found it in an old book dating from 1890, and I found another in a book in 1925, and I've done lots of books since then. I've always picking up books and reading them, you know me, I live with books. I haven't found it mentioned, but basically coup de grande, and there are some earlier writings, it appears to be, it comes up occasionally. And basically the idea is you land further away and you envelop. You're basically landing your forces at the nearest practicable beach or landing position which you can get with minimal resistance. And if you consider, the Falklands War is a classic example of that, but so are various other operations the British do historically. And the British managed to mass their troops and advance, and using the fleet as well. The French always have to be covering themselves and going, well, hang on, what's the fleet doing? What's the fleet doing? What's the fleet doing? So they can never concentrate their force to try and create an overwhelming mass to deal with the troops attacking or defend against the troops because of the fleet. And this means that between Monckton and Rodney, they managed to take Martinique pretty darn quickly. It basically takes from the 5th of January to the 12th of February, and most of it's done in February. Most of it is done in February. And after they've taken it, they then take St. Lucia, Grenada, St. Vincent, Tobago, and they're also considering moving the troops to Cuba. Yes, Martinique's returned to France in the Treaty of Paris in 1763, but there was an actual debate about it. But, you know, that's one of the things, again, the British do quite a lot in wars, is they capture territory to exchange back at the end of the war. And one of the arguments which was once made was, why do the British not take these islands and keep them permanently for themselves? Is because the islands are quite easy for them to take with their naval power, and they're things to take off the French in a war. So you give them back to them, knowing them you can take them off them anytime you need to, anytime you want to in war, so you will have negotiating position, a stronger negotiating position with which to negotiate the peace at the end. One of the interesting things that comes up throughout history, especially, and this is a period when it's very much a multipolar world we're talking about. Lots of great power competition going on, even in this period of the Age of Sail in the 18th and 19th centuries. What you find going on here is a lot of transactional relationships, a lot of transactional negotiations. And the key thing usually is to try and get things which the other side wants. But you never give anything for nothing. You never give sort of basically go, right, you're going to offer me nothing, but I'm going to give you this. No. You go, I don't want to give you this. I'm not going to give you anything. I'm not going to give you anything. I'm not going to give you anything. I like peace, though, because, well, it's getting in the way of trade. How much does peace matter to you? So we're getting rich off the war. We are. And then slowly, it's which side blinks first usually becomes the weaker one. Which side has lost the war and feels like it's lost the war because it's lost more items, lost more piece of land, is usually the one which has to blink first. Or the side which is considered a losing side is often in these scenarios is if a side goes offensive and they haven't won. Okay? It's a really random thing, but it actually makes sense. If you're a big power and you're expecting to win a war and you don't win a war, then you basically have to withdraw first. You have to concede first because you're losing. That's the thing about being great power. To be a great power, you need to be able to swamp the smaller powers quickly. If you can't do that, you're not a great power. You might be bigger, but if you haven't managed to steamroller your opponent, then you're going to need to make some concessions. And Martinique is part of that, because the French, for example, were probably the stronger military power at this time period. And they hadn't managed to steamroller the British and their allies. They hadn't in this scenario. And so by capturing places like Martinique, etc., the British were making it steeper, the cost greater. Now, in a way, they pushed too far, and that's what leads to some of the stuff around the American War of Independence and all these things, and the French doing what they're doing then. But that's the scenario you have. The British are cranking up the metric on their side, so when it comes to the peace negotiations, they can negotiate from very great strength. And what they want out of 7 Years' War, remember, is Canada. And these islands are about them getting Canada and making sure they get Canada. And even the garrisons which the French might still have there, eventually, have to be withdrawn because it's being signed over in return for this being returned. It's always the eye on the prize for these sort of wars and these sort of peace treaties. Now, while this is going on, of course, the American War of Independence does start up, and that's going on. Honestly, Rodney has a very interesting impression of army officers. He's not always always the biggest fan of them, and he does suggest that George Washington, as a former army officer, could probably just be bought. Not sure if that's a personal suggestion about George Washington or just his opinion of army officers. I think it's the latter. There are some people who suggest it's a personal opinion of George Washington, but he never met him. He's basing his opinion on army officers, and for him, the army officers who are energetic, efficient, and true patriots are rare. The army officers who bought their commissions, and who are just going to sit there on his decks and do frigating all, he's had rather too much contact with. So, we can consider that one. It's also at this point that he, between the occupation of fallen Martinique and the beginning of the American War of Independence, he starts to get promoted up. And it's now I have to sort of explain this because there are some really interesting discussions out there on the internet, so I'm putting in a bit of an explanation. The ranking seniority goes Rear Admiral Blue, Rear Admiral the White, Rear Admiral the Red, and that's your promotion path. A source of theoretically, okay? Vice Admiral Blue, White, Red, etc. on this. Now, the thing is, thanks to these flag systems, you can be promoted to Vice Admiral, but maybe you're a really good you're a really good Rear Admiral, and you might have started out as a Rear Admiral the Blue. But I might make you a Vice Admiral the White when I promote you to a Vice Admiral. Or I might make you a Rear Admiral the White. I might promote you directly to Rear Admiral the Red. I've got options. This is how I add options into my promotion. And remember, these come from the original squadron structure when there was a red, a white, and a blue squadron. The van, the centre, the rear, etc. The red is in the centre. Traditionally, the Admiral of the Red was also the Admiral of the Fleet, but eventually there's Admiral of the Fleet as a separate rank, and so Admiral of the Red is implemented. Commodore is a rank which you give to a captain when they're doing a role. They get a pennant, but they don't get a flag. It's a temporary posting. And before you find this incredibly interesting, just wait. The Royal Navy don't make it more than a temporary posting till after the Falklands War. In 1982, the Amphibious Task Group Commander, Michael Clapp, is Commodore Michael Clapp. He has a substantive rank of captain. No one has a greater rank. And this causes an interesting thing down there, because if anything happens to Rear Admiral Sandy Woodward, theoretically you'd think, well, that means the Commodore's going to take charge. Technically, it has to go to the senior captain who's down there, who was probably a guy called Captain Coward, but there is a whole debate about whether he's the senior captain or not on his Type 22, and he's sitting on a Type 22 frigate, doing all sorts of interesting operations. Probably him, but it might not be him. There's a whole debate about that, because whilst the politicians thought it must obviously go to the Commodore, the Commodore is a Commodore because he's in charge of the Amphibious Task Group, and so he's given that rank for to carry out his duties. Not because he's a Commodore. He's a captain. And it was after the Falklands War that they finally went, you know what, we're going to resolve this. They're going to sort this one out. Because it's confusing us all. And now Commodore is a substantive rank in the Royal Navy, so you can go captain and then be promoted to Commodore and then all that stuff. But in this period, Commodore is still very much still pennant. There was... The reason this is coming up, as I've mentioned, but haven't quite known, is some people have suggested that what happens is you would get promoted up Rear Admiral the Blue, Vice Admiral the Blue, Admiral the Blue, and then go down to Rear Admiral the White, and then be promoted up again, and then bound. No, that doesn't happen. That really, really doesn't happen. There is no scenario where someone turns up and goes, well, I'm A Rear Admiral the Red, and you're only an Admiral the White, so I'm in charge of you. Doesn't happen. The Admiral the White would look at the Rear Admiral and go, shut up, you spotty little child, and bog off. Or probably just shoot them. There's a choice for them. So, basically, your promotions theoretically go this way, but the actual scenario is more like snakes and ladders. Because it's how good you are, how well you've been doing your operations, have you impressed people, and as an always a scenario, they can shove you off to the Yellow Squadron. Yellow Squadron, by the way, the yellow flag basically means we've given you this rank, now please leave and don't ever expect a naval command. Admirals of the Yellow. Basically, it's a promotion point. They can exit you from the promotion scales. They will, again, it's that promoting people out of the way of which they can cause trouble. You're no longer good, we'll promote you away. And on top of this, though, you have some other things. So, in the peacetime before the American War of Independence and all these things start to come up, and the various wars of the French that happen around the same time of the War of Independence, Rodney manages to get created a baronet. He marries another lady from Lisbon, Henrietta, the daughter of John Clive. He's made governor of the Greenwich Hospital, which he serves in from 65 to 70, 1765 to 1770, that is. He managed to lose a lot of money winning a seat in Northampton. Then he went off and served as Commander-in-Chief of the Jamaica Station in 1771. Was made Rear Admiral of Great Britain, which was an interesting ceremonial post, realistically, at the time. And, yeah, he did quite well. He did quite well. When his Jamaica command was taken off him and he wasn't given the governorship of Jamaica, which would have been very financially rewarding, in 1774, he goes to settle in Paris. This is because he's having to pay off quite a lot of debt. He ran up being, running for MP in non-Admiralty controlled seats, and because Rear Admiral Great Britain doesn't come with a paycheck. In 1778, though, February 1778, he is promoted to Admiral of the White. You see that? At this point, there is no Admiral the Red. That is the Admiral of the Fleet is the Admiral of the White, is the one above. There's no Admiral the Red in this period of history. So that comes in later. So that would be Admiral of the Fleet. So he's promoted to the most senior Admiral title you can get before you become Admiral of the Fleet. He's Admiral the White. He basically is in charge of any other naval officer he comes across. And this is important for what we're going to discuss as we go on. Because from this point onwards, he is the boss. His faction have got him up there. He's got up there. All the hobnobbing, all the work he's done has got him up there. And he's not done that much, but he's going to do a lot more. He's going to earn that title very quickly with the battles that are coming up. Now, with the title of Admiral of the White, it's quite unusual you necessarily get deployed immediately, because, usually save for the major fleet commands. But thanks to the help of Marshal Biron, his Parisian pal, helping him to return to London with his children, and paying the debt that was owed, and arrears was paid out, he managed to return and get a command post. There are some rumours he was offered a French command. This is not true. He wasn't. He was not. Now this time, unlike when he did the whole bombardment of Le Havre, he actually was heading to Gibraltar. When he began to Le Havre, the original cover story had been that he was going to resupply Gibraltar, but the fact he was in Cornwall recruiting people who knew the French North Coast kind of revealed it wasn't the case. if you're recruiting people and you're basically going, I need pilots who know the French North Coast, and I don't give a flying hoot how you know it, I just want the people who do know the French North Coast, and you will be paid handsomely for this, we all know where you're going, and it's not Gibraltar. But this time he was off to resupply Gibraltar. And as he was on his way to resupply Gibraltar, he came across some Spanish vessels. And it's rather fun because, well, he has 18 ships of the line and 6 frigates, so have a full fleet heading to sort out Gibraltar. And it comes across the Spanish, who have 9 ships of the line and 2 frigates. At this point, the Spanish should probably have been singing something like, I dreamed the dream of times gone by. Remembering the Armada when they had a massive fleet versus the British. This occasion, it's 18 ships of the line versus 9. This is not, therefore, a fair fight. Ergo is what Rodney specialises in, because Rodney really doesn't like the concept of a fair fight. He feels a concept of a fair fight is a wrong thing. Now, Rodney orders his force to form a line abreast and hone in on the Spanish, because he's not sure they actually have only 9 ships. And his flag captain wants them to engage immediately, but he doesn't want to run his fleet into an actual larger Spanish fleet, because the Spanish do have the capacity to have larger fleets. And they have, and on occasion they are very good sailors, and they can put a very good fleet together still in this period in 1780. And Rodney's a bit ill as well. But it's around 1400 hours that he is certain now that the ships were not the vanguard of a larger fleet, that they are the fleet. And he is facing something which is less than half his numbers. At this point, his instructions changed to chase at the best speed and engage Spanish ships from the rear as they came upon them. They were also attempted to focus on the lee side of the Spanish vessels, as this would prevent the Spanish attempts to gain harbour. And it also would mean, due to the roughness of the waves, that the Spanish vessels couldn't use their lower gun ports. So their lowest gun deck, which was also the gun deck which had their heaviest batteries, would not be able to fire. Again, Rodney does not, and this is something which has come forward already, but is something which comes forward a lot in his fleet command operations, does not understand the concept of fair fights. They're not supposed to be fair, they're supposed to be victories. And the battle just goes on into the night, and that's why it's called the Moonlight Battle, because it carries on into the night. And Rodney's own ship himself is involved. He gets fully into the fight. He really does feel that HMS Sandwich should be doing some of the fighting, and it's worthwhile noting that he's commanding from HMS Sandwich, which was a second rate, not the Royal George, which was a first rate. His fleet includes 2 90-gun ships and a 100-gun ship. He's on one of the second rates. There is Rear Admiral Digby is on a first rate, and a Rear Admiral Lockhart Ross is on Prince George, the other second rate. Why is this the case? Well, because Rodney felt Sandwich was a good handler and would give him the speed. He doesn't need... He's an Admiral of White. He can be on whatever ship he wants to be on. Whatever ship he wants as his flagship, he could get. So he's picked Sandwich. That's the point. When you're at that point on the tree, you get to pick what branch you're dangling on. And that is how he's able to push through this battle. It's a hard battle, especially for the Spanish. They have 2,500 killed, wounded, captured. 4 ships of the line captured. Another ship of the line was destroyed. And, well, how do I put this politely? Out of the 9 ships of the line, there are 2 more which are euphemistically discussed as interesting because, well, they are both captured, but, well, they seem to be retaken by their crews. It's kind of interesting. Spanish history, to an extent, some works claim that they were released on their parole to help keep them ready in the storm which came up afterwards. And the thing is, if you're released on parole, you're released on your honour. So if you act with honour, you won't retake the ship because you've been released on your honour to save everyone's lives. If you use that situation to take the ship, retake the ship, that would be therefore dishonourable. So there's a whole timeline of, do they retake the ship while they're supposed to be doing something whilst they're supposed to be helping with saving the ship, and that's on the release on their honour, or do they do it afterwards? That's a whole dispute and a fun thing to get into. The point I would say is no one really knows, unless they're aboard the ships, what exactly happened. And everyone has a stake in recording the timeline in their favour. In saving their honour, in saving their, their face. So, I'm not sure about that one. I wouldn't like to say. There are British historians and Spanish historians, alluding to it, but who are very firm one way or the other. And there's me sitting there going, it's a storm, A. B, there's a lot of stuff going on. It's a very fluid situation. Let's leave it at that. Because I wasn't there. I can tell you what the accounts say. I can tell you the British account is that they did it against their honour. And I can tell you that the Spanish account was they waited until honour had been satisfied and then they retook the ship. And I think that's a situation which is a judgment call on both sides, so, yeah. But the thing is, he's now getting the Admiral's share of 4 ships at a line. Think about that. Plus the cargoes they were carrying. That's nice. And after he has relieved Gibraltar and delivered reinforcement supplies there, he then goes, checks on Majorca, and then heads off to Martinique. And he managed to fight another battle in Martinique in 1780. And, well, this time he's got 20 ships of the line versus 23 ships of the line. And it's considered a bit of an inconclusive battle, but honestly, it's a... how do I put this politely? Gouchen is the French Admiral Comte de Gouchen has aims, and those aims are frustrated by Rodney. But this is another battle which shows the importance of your leadership and importance of selecting your people. Rodney has at the front of his force a captain called Robert Clarke, who's in charge of the Stirling Castle. That's his command. And, well, there was a discussion about how to work. Rodney had tried serious manoeuvres, and his plan was apparently to engage the rear and centre of the line, even though de Gouchen has more ships, to focus in on a position where he could overwhelm locally. And Rodney issued a signal which was for each ship to engage. The appropriate ship is paired with according to the distribution of the fleets. And his argument had been the fleet should, to an extent, break the line. And he wanted to break the line. That's always his plan, to break the line. Robert Clarke doesn't seem to want to do it. He either has a misunderstanding or he'd forgotten things and didn't get the things through. And, well, this means they end up having a rather normal battle But Rodney does manage to pass HMS Sandwich, his flagship, through the French line of ships, and to actually have a fight between her, Couronne, Triomphant, and Fendant solo for roughly an hour and a half, and beat them off. If the ships had followed and done his executed what he seems to have planned, but he seems to have failed to explain it properly to them, then it could have been a very decisive victory. And if Comte de Guichen has his squadron destroyed at this point in 1780, that will have an impact on the rest of history. It would have had a great impact on the rest of history. As it is, Clarke, who was the ship at the front of the van, of the line, in the van which was under the command of Rear Admiral Hyde Parker. Yes, the gentleman who, a few years later, would be the one who would send a signal that would give Nelson the opportunity to turn a blind eye or to carry on invading Copenhagen. Is his commander of his van. He also has Commodore Thomas Collingwood, in charge of the front ship of the centre line where Rodney was. In fact, that's probably one of his mistakes. Both the centre and the rear are led by commodores, and of course the centre has him in. The rear has a rear admiral in charge, Joshua Rowley. He had left a captain who had a somewhat good reputation at the front of the van. There is no other senior officer to converse with. There is no second position there to have a discussion and work out what to do. So Martinique, it's a couple of hundred killed on both sides, wounded. Broadly speaking, the French lose more. The French do lose 222 killed, 537 wounded, but no one loses any ships. It's not the success it needs to be. And it's not the success of later operations. That leads us to St. Eustace. Now, St. Eustatius, as I've discussed in live, is a complicated scenario because Rodney gets up to a lot of things on the grounds of I'm trying to impede the support for the US, because this is part of the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, which is also part of all the wars going on around at the time, as adjacent to, in context of, the American War of Independence or Revolutionary War, depending on who you are, what you call it, and what's going on. These things are part of the parcel going on around it. Now, St. Eustatius was not just an example of something to take off the Dutch. It was also an advantage because the large merchant community, made up of Americans, of Dutch, of French, of British, and a large group of Jewish extraction. There's always a dispute over quite which nationality they were, but so usually they're just grouped together as Jewish, but they have nations as well, I'm sure. It's the way it's grouped in. Were there and were trading and doing trade which was circumventing the British blockades of America and getting military supplies to the American government, revolutionary forces. Anyway, the trouble is, when they're doing it, when they're going in there, the British go in to capture it, the British find that there are lots of resources here, lots of things to take out, and they do try and take them all out. They capture a huge convoy. They send Rodney sends his favourite deputy, Hood, off to capture even more merchant ships which had left a couple of days before. They capture it very quickly because the Dutch forces there are completely overwhelmed. They are completely overwhelmed by the force. Now, The problem is, there is so much money that Rodney and the Vaughan get very much focused on working out what to do with it and personally managing it and trying to organise it so it's sent home and all the things are done properly. The issue is, Rodney's not even-handed in his approach. He is probably harsher on the Jewish merchants than he is on anyone else. And there doesn't seem to be necessarily a good reason for it. It's not like he's being harsh on specific merchants who just happen to be Jewish and he's ignoring the other Jewish population. He seems to be generally doing these things, and it's just he's more generous to the French, Dutch, and Spanish, and even American merchants than the Jewish ones. And it's just not a good time. He gets critiqued in Parliament, he gets critiqued at all sorts of things, and he's really not showing Rodney to his best. It's really not him showing himself to his best. By the time they leave after 10 months, they've taken many of the goods, everything they can away, and when it's eventually recaptured by the French, there's almost no resistance. Although, there is a lot of money belonging to Admiral Rodney and his forces, which is captured by the French troops and the Dutch colonists when they do manage to get the island back. But the big problem, realistically, with St. Eustatius is this. Rodney gets so focused on sorting out the money along with the general, and it's not unusual for them at the time, that it's Hood who's sent with some ships to go and support Admiral Graves, which leads to the Battle of Chesapeake under Graves. If Rodney had left most of his ground forces here and left the army to sort it out, and he'd landed with a few thousand troops, so he could have done that, and had taken the large bulk of his fleet, and he did have a large fleet with him, to go to New York, and then that fleet combined with Graves' force under Rodney's command had fought at the Battle of Chesapeake, there is a possibility that the Battle of Chesapeake ends up being very different. And I say this because the Battle of Chesapeake, the French have 24 ships, the British have 19 ships. Shortly after all those losses and all those issues, in 1782 in the Battle of Saints, Rodney will amass 36 ships to take on 30 ships at the Battle of Saints. And that'll be his last great big victory. At the time, he certainly has enough ships that if he'd led the ships off, Hood's reinforcements would probably be double that they were historically, which would mean there would be more ships in terms of the British side at that Battle of Chesapeake, and Rodney would have been in charge. And you cannot say it would necessarily change the outcome, but Rodney, with more ships and being a better commander than Graves, and I don't think anyone's really going to argue that ground, that Rodney is a better commander than Graves, means that there is a good chance that Chesapeake changes and the whole course of the American War of Independence might change. I say might because, honestly, any kind of scenario like that, any kind of occupation, any kind of ongoing against a hostile, trying to control a hostile force from over the seas, is not going to work out. Trying to maintain control of a hostile population, if you're not prepared to commit genocide to do it, is never going to work out, and frankly, you shouldn't be prepared to commit genocide. It's not a good thing. And I add that in because if I don't state that, I know someone will clip that bit and then go away saying, Dr. Clarke says this is a reason to commit genocide. No, it's not. But basically, long term, if you want to, you either have to commit some form of cultural genocide and take over the population and turn them into your population, or you have to commit physical genocide where you wipe them out. That is the only way you can maintain control at that distance without ruinously expensive garrisoning and ruinously expensive occupation. That will be an ongoing fight and feud for as long as it goes on. And you don't want to do those things because they're not good. And why do I say they're not good? Because the strength of humanity as a whole lies in its differences and its different approaches to problems and solutions and how you get them. And there are similarities and the differences, and sometimes the innovation comes from those differences. And any form of genocide removes that. And that's not a good thing for the population as a whole. Anyway, the Battle of Saints. I can't believe I have to say things like genocide is bad to avoid people clipping them on the videos, but I do. I know, because I've had the comments and dealt with it before when I haven't added those things in. The Battle of Saints. Probably the most glorious battle that's ever taken place, when the commander was technically about to be relieved of command, and which would lead to the government actually having a panic attack, because when they get the news of the fact that he's just won this battle, this great glorious battle, they try and race after the ship which is carrying his replacement to tell him to return, but they don't get there in time, and so the admiral, who's the glorious hero, comes home looking like you've just stabbed him in the back, and then has to deal with the political fallout of it. It's an absolutely farcical slapstick comedy of a time period, but it's British politics and British naval command in the late 18th century. Now, Saints is an island between Guadeloupe and Dominica, and pretty much what happens is Rodney sails from St. Lucia, the French fleet, de Grasse, sails from Martinique, and it's a tail chase until you get to the 9th of April, when there's a short action, and then on the 12th of April they have their proper fight. And that fight goes as Rodney had wanted it to do. Now, at this point, I have to admit, he's kind of learned his mistake from the past. He really has. The van is commanded by Rear Admiral Sir Samuel Hood, who is an incredibly hard charger. And the ship at the front is a ship called HMS Royal Oak, Captain Thomas Burnett, when he originally organises things. The centre is commanded by Rodney himself, and he has, at the front of the centre force, he has Captain Thomas Graves, but also Commodore Edmund Affleck in charge of and they're aboard HMS Bedford. And the rear, well, the rear is commanded, has HMS Russell at its front, Captain James Saumarez. Yeah, James Saumarez, who goes on to become the admiral known for his battle in the Second Battle of Algeciras and all sorts of interesting things. A very, very capable officer for the Royal Navy. And the flagship of the rear is HMS Princessa, which is a third-rate 70-gun ship commanded by Rear Admiral Francis Samuel Drake. Yes, descendant of that Drake. Or at least familial relative. It's some sort of great-great-nephew. Honestly, I should probably do a workout on his family tree at some point so I could provide you a full list of how many Drakes serve in the Royal Navy and how you can try them out. But yeah, he takes after his forebear, let's just say this. So this is a kind of aggressive fleet. I don't think at any point would they say a fleet which contains names Hood, Rodney and Drake is going to not be aggressive. When you look through the senior officers as well, in terms of the captains of ships, they're also similarly quite aggressive and quite well endowed of the desire to get close to the enemy and do probably nasty things to them. So yeah, they are well prepared for the Battle of the Saints. They are really well prepared for the battle. And what, broadly speaking, happens was that after the first action, the action on the 9th, and with the repairs still going on with Hood's van division, which had taken the lead in that action. Rodney swaps the divisions round, and Drake's division, which was the rear, is now in the lead. This is the advantage of having two admirals who are both equally aggressive, in charge of your subdivisions, and with having officers who are reliable in charge. Now, as said, the first ship for Drake, was theoretically going to be James Samaras. Yeah, that was the front of the line. It's supposed to be the front of the line as it was officially laid out. But the rear of that rear was a captain called Taylor Penny. Officially, it's supposed to be the rear. Supposed to be the rear. And again, they'd chosen their officers at either end, so they were going to lead, and the fleet would follow. And it's actually Marlborough under Captain Taylor Penny, which ends up being at the front, and leads the British line and opens the battle. Now, they start off with the initial attack almost proceeding as if they are doing the line of action, as it's supposed to be. They look as if they're proceeding in the contrasting lines and going to be sharing fire. And Marlborough is the vessel which opens fire first when it's ordered to by Formidable at 8 a.m, which is Rodney's flagship. And Marlborough is opposite the Dauphin Royal when she opens fire. And she opens fire well, and then Arrogant opens up, and all the ships open up as they're supposed to be. Drake does well, holding the French in position. And as they are in position, and as they get in position, it's Formidable at the centre of the British line, which, well, Rodney being Rodney, notices a break. Rodney notices a break. And he gets his captain to hammer it with Formidable. He basically turned it around to Sir Charles Douglas and John Sims. Sir Charles Douglas is the lead captain there, and is basically acting, whereas Sims is more of a staff officer at this point. And turns around and goes, "Go for it." And they do. They really do. And so they break the French line. And when you manage to break the French line as they do, thanks to the advantages of the wind, well, it leads to the French breaking up their formation. The forward part of the line can't turn around in time to come back and help. And the aft part of the line is just piling in and cannot keep formation, cannot keep line, and it's turning into a melee engagement. And the thing is, the advantage you're supposed to have at this battle was 36 ships of the British versus 30 ships of the French, which was still an advantage. Okay, don't get me wrong, it's still an advantage. Ships of the line versus 30 ships of the line. When this happens, you end up with a scenario of more like 30 British ships of the line versus roughly 20 French ships of the line. But those ships of the line are coming in to the battle one at a time almost. They're not being able to mutually support each other until they get in position, which allows you to wear them down. And yeah, the French end up with 4 ships of the line captured. 1 destroyed. 8,000 personnel, roughly, dead, wounded, or captured. Versus the British, which were a little over 1,000 dead or wounded. It's a tremendous difference in loss. And it's a tremendously vicious battle once you've managed to make this break. You're established of breaking the line. And what was probably worse for the French was they also had their admiral, the Comte de Grasse, surrender. A good admiral, but he was forced to surrender. You lost your own commanding officer. That is always a bad point. And in the aftermath, well, as said, Rodney finds out he's being replaced. Hood felt after the battle that Rodney could have captured 20 French ships if Rodney had maintained the chase. But Rodney didn't think so. The trouble is, for Hood to say that, it comes with the thing of Hood was already patching his ships up before this battle began, which is why Rodney has switched the formations around. So he's already got about roughly a third of his ships damaged to the point that he's had to switch the fleet around. So that takes him down to technically 24 ships in roughly good condition. 26, 28 is probably the actual number once you start looking at them. And then you have the fact that they've just gone through another battle, and he's got a lot of those beaten up. So despite them winning, they've also been damaged. A chase would be glorious. A chase would have been glorious, but it might not have got you anything more. In fact, it probably wouldn't have. Because what state are your ships in? And the thing is, Rodney's won a battle. Yes, you could argue he could go ahead and win the war, but he could also lose it. If he runs into a storm, which, by the way, is what happens when Admiral Graves is later on trying to take the prizes back to Britain, and loses a whole lot of them in a storm. If he loses a load of ships in a storm because they go charging out chasing the French, and they get caught by one in the Atlantic, and they're not in good condition, then suddenly the advantage is won. The control of the Caribbean he's sought, the strength of the station which has been hard fought for, is lost. See, this is often the problem when you come into it. It's what does Command of the Sea mean? Does Command of the Sea mean that I've wiped out my opponent? It might well do. That is a scenario for it. But that's only really something if there's a huge mismatch in sizes of your forces. If there isn't, then it's husbanding resources. Using them to win battles, yes, not using forces is stupid. But overusing forces can be equally stupid. Losing forces to enemy action is one thing in war. Losing forces to attrition by the sea is another. You've got to balance those two options and those risks. But as said, after this, he's replaced. He comes home to a hero's welcome, but in many ways he is going to be a complicated soul. Admiral Hugh Pigot has to take over from him, and yeah, the Whig government who'd sent him out to replace them learnt their lesson, and from that point on, governments really do learn their lesson. The idea is, if there's an admiral in charge, you wait till the end of the season when they come home. Usually, they bring their ships home to maintain, etc. And then you change command. You don't do change of command in season because the government's changed, because otherwise you might end up with doing the absolute kick in the teeth, self-kick in the teeth of, this is a great hero who's come home to great acclaim and who we've just replaced an admiral purely because he's a Tory and we're Whigs. Purely because of that. He has issues afterwards. He does have issues after this. He has certainly had some issues with how he's applied his patronage. He gave his son a lot of support, and his interest in terms of setting up his family does alienate officers even of his own faction within the Navy, let alone the wider Admiralty. But he also gets very old very quickly after he comes home. His life had been service at sea and service of the nation, and he'd spent his body hard doing that. When we talk about him having, in 1782, received a pension and all sorts of things from the government, and the fact he lives on till 1792, in the 18th century, that's a very old age. That's a very old age. The battles we're talking about, the Battle of Saints especially, that takes place in 1782. In April 1782. When he is 64 years old. 64. And he has spent a large bulk of his life out at sea. Honestly, we normally would say 1732 onwards. We normally would list it as early as that. Sometimes we can argue earlier. But quite simply, he spent 50 years at sea by the time he has this victory. 50 years. His body is wrecked. He is definitely not the man he was. But the thing is, he'd always been able to rally his health being at sea. After this, he's now too senior, and there is too much political thing over him, because if you reappoint him, it's going to cause other trouble with his relationship with other officers over, especially St. Eustace, etc. It means he's not able to be reappointed for the last 10 years of his life. He's not able to be given another fleet. I would say, though, there is a measure of the man in that when he has a choice of what ship to take home, as his ship to take home with him, he doesn't take Formidable. He doesn't take his big ship, which he has won victories on, which he's won laurels, which he's perfectly, as an Admiral of the White, is perfectly acceptable for him to do. Take a second-rate home with him. No. He takes himself to HMS Montague. Montague is a third-rate. She's also a third-rate which had been part of the van and a ninth, and which had been damaged and repaired. She's a 74-gun ship. He goes home in her. I can find problem and lots of faults in what Rodney does. Personally, that is not my style, and it's definitely not my, it's a very different period, and he is a man of his period, certainly. And he has the excesses of his period. But when I think about the battles that happened later, the wars that happened later, and the conflicts, and what some admirals do versus others when they're being recalled home, and how they travel home, and when they stand on honour and go, "No, I must take my flagship home. This big, powerful second-rate or first-rate must come with me." And I think of Rodney, Admiral of the White, as senior an admiral as you can be. having just won a massive victory which had secured control of the Caribbean and which allowed his fleet to dominate over a very capable opponent. Who has been replaced because of politics. Doesn't turn around and demand he takes his status symbol home with him. He goes to a third rate. Yeah, he could have gone slightly smaller, I suppose, a 64 rather than a 74. But honestly, there's more space to accommodate the personnel, the people who are coming with him. The family and the other extended people, his staff who are coming with him. So, yeah, 74 is probably the minimum he could actually go to. That's a good professional officer. And if you're thinking I'm making thinly veiled comments about certain admirals before the Battle of Trafalgar, you're right, I am. There are a few other battles which I could go into where other admirals play similar things. I've won a great battle! I must take home my flagship, rather than leaving here for the next battle. I can't be seen to go home in a smaller ship. Really? What are you compensating for, mate? Anyway, I always finish these videos with a question, and I've been honest, the question I've mentioned it the whole way through. What faction do you think Rodney belonged to? Which faction? And what do you think it's a faction which still is around, the faction do you think still around today? And what do you think of these officers were in World War II and World War I? Because it is. As I talked about, just like the other faction I discussed, his faction, and they don't really seem to have names, but they do have, as said, they are about patronage, about your thinking, and the way you approach problems, than necessarily about who you or what you are. I'd love to hear what you think of those things. I'd love to hear your answers to that. What have we got coming up? Well, tomorrow we have John Jarvis, Admiral St. Vincent. That's going to be a fun one. Take care. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Bit of an Age of Sail map, this is.